Hi, everybody, and welcome to yet another lovely talk in the Holy Family Church here in Seal Harbor. And we're so happy that we have such a fabulous speaker today. I sat next to him at lunch, and Bill is not only a renowned gardener, but he was also the head of the preservation. Is it the preservation arm of the Gardener Conservancy? And he has written a very nice book, which we're all fighting over in the front pew here. And you can get these afterward. Do you have enough copies for everybody? More to come. Okay. And I'm right here about his life in gardening. And I can't wait, Bill. Thank you so much for coming here. On the way to Vermont, which took him 2 whole days. He came by stagecoach,
So you all know who Bill is because you're here, and I'm sure you're as eager to see his garden as I am. But I also wanted to add a note because I'm the president of the Beatrix Farrand Society, and Bill was from the Nature Conservancy, from the Garden Conservancy, and it's really the Garden Conservancy that organized the Beatrix Farrand Society in the early days. And really, without those the organizational skills that they gave us, and the insights that they gave us, I don't think we would be a viable nonprofit, which is something we can now say. So with that, I would like to introduce Bill Noble with great pleasure. Thank you, Scott. There were many people involved with the Garden Conservancy, and we are so grateful and proud of everything that the Beatrix Farrand Society has accomplished over the years. And I mean, you're rock solid. I was last year, 10 years ago, speaking at the Beatrix Farrand Society symposium, and everyone's still here. The garden's still here, and there are more people involved. So good for you all. And thank you, Christine, and thank you, Micheline, for all your help getting us here. And thank you, Martha, for your wonderful hospitality and giving me fuel enough to zoom through many more slides than you all are going to sit through. But what I'm going to do this afternoon is tell you a little bit about my background, the gardens that have inspired me from gardens that the Garden Conservancy has assisted. And then what I want to do is delve into the first half of the presentation to talk about the guiding principles behind my garden. And the reason I even have any guiding principles is that Timber Press asked me to write this book, Spirit Place, the Making a New England Garden. And that book came out in the early summer of 2020. Do we remember where we all were in the early summer of 2020? And I had the great fortune of working with our local independent bookstore, the North Bookstore. And over the course of that summer, we had a half dozen ticketed events with everyone in masks. But it was the first time that many people had been in a garden setting with other people, and the sense of community and spirit that I experienced in launching this book is one of the highlights of my life. So I'm going to talk about principles, and then I'm going to do a mad dash through the various parts of the garden. The other thing about Timber Press is Andrew Beckman and Tom Fisher asked me to write this book, and for the longest time it felt like a vanity project. He said, okay, I'm going to go to my garden and take beautiful pictures. What's the point? And one day it came to me, my partner Jim Payton is here, and Jim taught young people, taught college for his career. And 2 younger people came to mind One living in Trenton and the other living in Brooklyn. And they both visited the garden a number of times. They loved the garden. They asked me about it. They want advice on how to grow arugula on the fire escape. And so I saw these two people the whole time I read the book. And what I was seeing was not just younger people finding themselves as gardeners in their young 40s, as I did, but I wanted to get them to think about gardens as part of our cultural heritage and to support public gardens and to visit public gardens and to become excited about gardens like Garden Farm and so many other gardens that we are all passionate about. So that's the optimistic impetus. And what I'm going to do today is show you pictures that I hope you think will be beautiful. And I applied over some of the challenges involved in making this garden over the last 30 years. But I don't want to begin by saying there are no challenges. The challenges seem to be accelerating. The garden is 30 plus years old, and gardens at that age start to show leaky bones. And gardeners of my age start to show leaky bones. And our climate is going past the leaky bones. So this beautiful photograph is of the Quebec wildfires and the smoke that we experienced so many days of this summer. So it's beauty and it's frightening. And then 2 months of record rainfall and devastation for the citizens, so many citizens of my state. 4,700 households affected by flooding 2 weeks ago. But still, we still have that's for sure. And there's a sense that gardens need to find their way to a sense of resiliency. And maybe that's the next talk that I'll get there. But I began my life as a failed academic, left the University of Toronto, moved to the Upper Valley, Vermont, and New Hampshire, worked as a community organizer, then a woodworker, and then I really wanted to be outside. And I found myself growing 10 acres of vegetables, and I find myself through a farm stand, and wholesale food, and farmers markets that so I cleared $5,000 my first year, and thought that was great. And by year X, when I was doing $5,000 a year, it was time to move on. And luckily, I fell into a job with the National Park Service. And National Park Service really gave me direction in life. I became a part-time gardener at the St. Lawrence Historic Site in Cornish, New Hampshire. And for those of you who don't know this place, it is certainly worth the drive to the Connecticut River Valley to Cornish, New Hampshire, the home studio and the gardens of the great American sculptor Augustus St. Gaudens have been preserved. It's been a public garden since the 1920s, so 100 years of the place being open and inviting the public. And so I learned ornamental gardening on the job. And then I also learned about the many other gardens and gardeners and landscape architects that had made Cornish a really special place. Ellen Biddle Shipman, I hope that's a name that's familiar to many of you. She said at Cornish that it represented the renaissance of gardening in America. The landscape architect Charles Platt had settled there. A number of houses in his gardens have been made there and have been lovingly maintained or restored by future owners. So what did I learn? I learned about perennial gardening, but I also learned about native plants. Look at these hedges, hemlock as a hedge material, and this and paper birch, white pine hedges. So the plants being dug out of the neighboring hillsides were creating the structure of this garden. St. Gaudens was successful, but he was not a wealthy man. And so he planted a half a mile worth of pine and market hedges. And what I saw was that I was working with someone who was gardening in 3 dimensions. And the focus was on the flower garden, perhaps. But I really learned how a sculptor can approach a garden by shaping land and creating spaces and playing with the light. I was invited to by members of the Platt family and other garden owners to help them manage. Restore might be too much of a word, but manage these 100-year-old gardens now. And my friend Joan Platt invited me to help redo her garden, which now looks nothing like this. But here we have the view that Charles Platt created for himself when he was first setting out as a architect, landscape architect, designer. He had, I don't know how many of you know Platt. It's a name that has largely disappeared, but was significant houses and gardens, and a tremendous impact on the landscape industry, Cornish, New Hampshire. But he was he and his brother traveled to Italy, photographing and writing about gardens. And his book, Italian Gardens, 1894, was the first book that combined photographs and writing on Italian Renaissance gardens for an American audience. Edith Wharton's book came just a little bit later. It had far more of an impact. But he was looking at and studying Italian Renaissance gardens, but he also was a landscape painter early on. So if you look at this photograph, the houses here, they're down in Connecticut is about Mount Stutney, the right, the Mont to the right, the Hampshire to the left. And then this shape here, he created. He was leading the eye from a very formal picture into a much less formal, more informal and wilder landscape, as a landscape painter might have, or as Italian Renaissance garden designers might have. And then Ellen Biddle Shipman had a tremendous influence on the gardens of Cornish. She redid the flower gardens at the St. Gaudens site in the 1920s and the 1940s. She had a long involvement there. She collaborated with Charles Platt, especially early in her career, and logged 600 projects, over 600 projects in the United States, and had her house and garden in neighboring Plainfield. And some of the things I learned from her was that she wrote that privacy is the most essential attribute of any garden. And that kind of struck home. And then she too, the way she used the plants of the Connecticut River Valley to connect her garden to the greater landscape. And then I was asked to help the new owners of Northcote, the Stephen Parish Garden, father of Maxfield Parish, and Maxfield Parish also gardened in Cornish, and many of his illustrations influenced by that landscape and the light of the Connecticut River Valley. And Stephen Parish was sort of the most ambitious of the resident Cornish gardeners, and kept logs of plants and wildlife, birds especially, and photographs. And you could see him create his garden over a 20 to 30 year period. And I was fortunate enough to have access to all of these materials at the Rare Books Library at Dartmouth, and to work with the new owners to help put parts of it back together. And then after a while, I wanted to spread my wings, and the John Hay Estate was a new part of the Fish and Wildlife Service, with a significant garden made by his son and daughter-in-law, Clarence and Alice Appleton Hay, on the shores Lake Sunapee in central New Hampshire. So here we see the lake, we see the mountain, and we see Clarence Hayes' majestic acre rock garden, one of the best documented and better known rock gardens of the heyday of the first heyday of the 20th century rock garden making in the 1920s and 30s. Hay too had traveled in Europe, but he wasn't trying to bring Italy home to his gardens the way St. Gaudens and Platt and the others were. It was much more influenced by English, the new English style of perennial borders. And so there was a formal flower garden and rose garden. But the piece that really spoke to me, in addition to the rock garden, was how he married an estate garden with a series of formal events and less formal events, and made them disappear into and bring into the woods and bring the woods into the garden. The story is that his two highest marks at Harvard were in forestry and landscape gardening, and he got a B- in both of them. And that was working with the Garden Conservancy. That was a Garden Conservancy project. And then the Garden Conservancy invited me to work nationally as director of preservation. And I got to meet some of the most incredible and generous contemporary gardeners of our time, or maybe the post-World War and late 20th century gardens. And a couple made a real impact on me, especially this garden of Ione and Emmett Chase in the Pacific Northwest. So here we're looking at Mount Rainier, and we're working in a garden of people who loved where they lived, loved hiking on the shoulders of Mount Rainier, and wanted to make a garden at a much lower elevation, much wetter elevation, so they couldn't grow all these fabulous alpines that thrive under snowpack on Mount Rainier. But Ione trained as a seamstress. Her husband worked in a hydroelectric, as a former hydroelectric. She knew how to take rugged, old-fashioned plants and grow them on, divide them, and to create a tapestry, an alpine tapestry, out of simple garden plants, veronicas and ajugas and dianthus, and echo the more rugged alpine shoulders of Mount Rainier. And then Nancy Goodwin in North Carolina pressed many plants on me to take home to Vermont, the plants that thrived in the North Carolina garden, and pressed those plants on me to bring them home and try them in Vermont. And some of them are now us common garden plants, hellebores, but this is in the 1990s when there were very few people working around with hellebores, and then others. And then this garden, the John Ferry Garden outside Houston, which is now a public garden. And we worked with John for many, many years to set Peckerwood Garden up as a public garden. And John and I became good friends. We traveled to Mexico together, collecting plants and seeing indigenous art. But John taught beginning design to students of architecture at Texas A&M. And John had a real interest in light, and he said that light is the one free commodity available to gardeners. And just how true that is in his garden, where there were just splashes of color. His garden is about texture and light. And although I think John and I settled on there being one plant that we could grow in common, the concept stuck. And then the last of the gardens I'll mention is George Schulkoff's Hollister House Garden in Washington, Connecticut, which is well on its way to becoming a public garden. It's open 3 days a week and has a really well-attended garden study weekend early in September every year. And so I urge you to visit Hollister House, but It's a garden inspired by English gardens, Hitchcock and Sissinghurst in particular, but George brought those ideas and worked with a New England aesthetic and an exuberant use of plants. So now to our garden. Luckily, so Jim was teaching. He had an offer to go somewhere else. He declined the offer, and he said, "We got to shake things up." So that meant moving out of a very small and comfortable house into something that was much too large. But he was looking for something modern, with a spacious living room for his Steinway B-grade piano, and I wanted something sort of modest and old where I could, have a cottage garden. And luckily, Jim is the person who found this house. And this is 1991 that we moved in, September of 1991. And we moved into a farmhouse on a piece of land that had been settled in 1767, and that through the course of the 19th century had grown to 300 acres and was a fairly prosperous sheep farm for a couple of decades. And by the end of the 19th century, there were no more sheep, but it was providing milk and dairy to Dartmouth College just down the road. And then in the early 1920s, back to the Landers, Bob and Betty McKenzie moved up from Somerville, Massachusetts, and began farming, milking 16 cow. And Betty lived there from 1922 till her death in the house in 1990. So here we see house, L extension, barn which still stands, former hay barn, and milking parlor here. So we're on a north slope. We're in the Connecticut River Valley. So here we're looking at Moose Mountain above Hanover, New Hampshire, and then up the Smarts and Cube, and some of the foothills of the White Mountains up here. We're at 1,150 feet elevation. The soils are loamy, neutral, prime Vermont agricultural soils. Zone 4B is what it shows up on the map. Last year, we had a number of nights of minus 28, and last year a number of days of 95 degrees Fahrenheit plus. So it's a typical place to garden. So without going into too much, the house was in fairly good condition, just needed a new roof and this and that. But Betty McKenzie was a gardener, and as in so many old gardens, some of the plants that we bring in loose themselves upon the landscape. So goutweed and various roses and too many to name had engulfed the house. So a little bit of time spent cleaning out what did not belong there revealed kind of what did belong there. And old roses. Betty had collected old roses. The beauty bush was hers. There's a row of peonies in the front. And so the first few years were sort of taking stock, coming home on weekends from jobs that were all around the country, and sort of going at it. But also taking stock of the site and seeing these marvelous, substantial granite stone retaining walls, century-old or 75-year-old sugar maples, President Lincoln lilac planted in the 1920s in front of the one remaining barn, and then apple trees, some intentional and some seedlings, it would appear, as part of one of the defining elements of this cultural landscape, and the barn. So I began in the front, and I also began by making the decision that I was going to leave the front yard mainly as Betty Mackenzie had kept it. It really worked. It just needed some cleaning, and it felt like a really friendly gesture to the neighborhood to leave good enough alone. Except, of course, for what had been a flower garden of hers, and she, in her later years, had removed everything from the flower gardens and mulched them over. Really thoughtful way to leave a garden for the next gardener. And so this became just a place to experiment with plants brought home from various jobs and so forth. But the challenges were all going to be in the back. And the chief challenges were the scale of the landscape. My jaw dropped when we walked through a door here onto this porch, and I saw a 180-degree view, and then into our neighbor's living room and the television. Really wonderful neighbors, really great neighbors. But this is obviously where the challenges were going to be. So this had been the Mackenzie's vegetable garden with, barbed wire and tin plywood. And that's where we are 25, 30 years later. And so now what I'd like to do is sort of move into some of those principles. So some of which I think were conscious from the start, and then some I grew over the years, and then some really came into focus and were articulated in writing the book. So most of the development was going to happen out back, and that it was going to evolve out of the remnants of the former barns and the vegetable garden. I was going to work with a structure that had been there, that had mostly disappeared, but had remnants. And then I felt that the garden should feel like a natural outgrowth of the place, and that it needed to harmonize with its architecture, which is a vernacular architecture. The house is 1840s and sort of early Greek revival architecture, and the barn's really functional buildings. But I wasn't going to, like George Shulkoff in making Hollister House, moved a lot of earth and has done beautifully. The results are beautiful. But I was going to use the topography as I found it for the most part, and the natural features around it. And then in this 180-degree view, I saw that the best views were to the east and to the northwest, and that I should do as much as I could to feature and preserve the views. And this view to the east is the most dramatic. And then it took me a while to realize that I'd been given the gift of the sky as part of the garden. And I've been in so many gardens where they're a little more two-dimensional, and the action, the light, the activity of the sky is a really significant part of the garden. I'll also mention that I should have that our piece is 22 acres, and Canada is here. So the area, the garden itself encompasses 2 to 3 acres. So here we're looking towards the northwest and working to screen and to frame sort of more pastoral, rural views. And then there's a long view to the north that connects those two more focused views of mostly pine and some deciduous woodland, stone walls bordering hayfields. So the barn foundations needed some cleaning up. All of the broken glass from the milking parlor went away, the tin roofing, but I saw that I could use this structure to create something. I didn't know what that was going to be at the beginning, very much did not know what that was going to be, but I just knew that I wanted to assess, see what was there, and spend some time thinking. But it's also true that I was just making this garden when I was in my very earliest years as a gardener. So I was just learning to garden by working at the Fells and the St. Gaudens place, but then bringing some of those ideas home and working through some of those ideas and plants at home. But this photograph is here partly to say, okay, so eventually I figured out what I was going to do with some of those barn foundations, and that I had this great gift of seeing what other gardeners were doing, and how Ione Chase was working with the alpine meadows of Mount Rainier in her own garden. So that idea of mountaintops, bringing mountaintops and those ideas closer into home with native junipers and cranberries, sedges, and others. The existing structure of the foundation walls is pretty extraordinary. This granite was not quarried nearby. This granite was hauled down the Connecticut River and then up 800 feet to this farm. So it appears, and so I've been able to work with that, and so far I've been able to complement some of these walls with some really large, coarse-leafed bold foliage plants. Rayums, this is a favorite Himalayan rayum, and then the Regersias have done really well in this garden until the last couple of years. So the screening, I could talk a lot about screening, but suffice it to say that Norway spruce ended up being the choice for better or for worse. And a landscape architect friend encouraged me to work with the existing apples, and so something of a grid or orchard was planted, and I don't think either one of us realized at the time just what a beautiful scene that combination of the screening spruce and the apples in front would make. So here we are. This is the end papers from the book. So, and this is here because some of the early screening ideas failed. The Norway spruces are still there, but some of the other ideas failed, and they failed pretty quickly. So I figured I needed to start trying to understand this place as a whole. So I used the term master plan, but really all I did was I measured the buildings and the barn foundations and put it on vellum or sketch or trace maybe, and then saw how they lined up or didn't line up and how I could connect spaces. But here we are. So we're over 30 feet from the road. We're 2 miles up from the village of Farrand Road. The house, like many built in the 19th century, really was a road, many parts of the house, elevation, existing barn, front yard, and then we walk through the deck, spinning porch, and view the poplars, vegetable garden, flower garden. And then a open grassy area with a long border, the dairy and hay barns were here, stables were there, orchard here. So eventually I'll walk you through that a little bit better. But I also said to myself early on that the plants should be the primary means of creating structure and interest rather than architecture or garden ornament. And I really did want a series of spaces and rooms for different experiences and a progression through the garden. And shrubs, using them either as more formal hedging or informal massing, along with trees, could help me achieve that structure. And then also early on, I said that the garden really needed to present well from the deck. I mean, that's where we live. We eat dinner on the porch. Friends who come to visit want to stay on the deck. A few of them might want to visit the garden, but things need to look good from the deck. But the only place to plant, to establish a vegetable garden was immediately below the deck. So that decision got made. And the deck is also where things can change themselves up from year to year, and we have a really nice, cool, dark, gravel-floored basement. So a number of these plants get wintered over in the dark cool of the basement and come out again in May. And then enhanced by annuals and with a shout out to Bunker Farm in Dummerston, Vermont, for some of the plants that they provide for this garden. And then for those of you who know Frank Cabot, you may know that he can be a very compelling person and of strong ideas. And I was waffling on planting Lombardy poplars as sort of a defining element between the garden and the landscape, as a backdrop, and also to help lift the eye up. And I'd seen so many failed Lombardy poplars in Cornish gardens, but Frank pointed to those that were successful in Quebec and said, because of my elevation, that I ought to give it a try. But what I needed to do was that at year 20, I had to top them. And so what you're seeing here are poplars that are maybe 26 years old that were all top here 3 or so years before this photograph was taken for the cover of the book. I won't go into that anything more, but then because the house is so close to the road, there really needed to be some protection from the road. And thinking back to Ellen Shipman, there needed to be some privacy. And thinking back to a beautiful century-old grove of paper birch that St. Gaudens planted in front of the studio that when I was there was still thriving. A group of white birch got planted in what had been the barnyard, the cow pen. So compacted soil, but this has become the place when we have groups come. This is where they want to gather. This is where they want to put out the food. This is where they want to sit. This is where they want to gather. And so we've created in a place that had very little shade 35 years ago. We've, in a relatively short time, have created a shaded gathering spot. And then even more private is my bench in the corner of the stable. And the bench is only 18 feet from the road here, but it's sort of miles away in its feeling of seclusion. And then the garden needed to be designed and maintained according to ecological principles and sustainability as I understand them. And I really wanted to enhance habitats for wildlife. In cleaning up around the house in the early years, I discovered that all that bird song that we'd been exposed to the first year or two disappeared. As the brambles and the buckthorn and everything went away. So I wanted to bring that back in closer to the house. And so that native plants, when I'm deciding what to do, should be employed when they're the best choice to build an environment rich in native flora and fauna. But I do say that when they're the best choice, and I certainly make other choices as well. And that plants should be grown as well as possible without chemical fertilizers or pesticides. The vegetable garden is entirely organic. So we're getting close to the end of these principles, but not quite there. So this is a garden of a plant collector. And I experiment with plants. Again, I began in the 1990s, and in my part of Vermont, there just weren't many gardens of interesting plant collections or variety of plants. And I had this free ride with the Garden Conservancy to travel all around the country and to bring a backpack with me and to fill that backpack with small plants from nurseries in the Pacific Northwest or North Carolina. So I began experimenting first with rhubarbs, rheums, and then willows and primulas, epimediums and saxifrages, and now I'm trialing hydrangeas serratas by the 24 probably. But although I collect plants, I don't want it to give the impression of being a collector's garden. And so I've taken pains to cultivate spaces to match the needs of the plants and then to arrange them in a way that feels pleasing to the eye. And that the garden should aim for outstanding quality of design and plant selection and maintenance, but I don't want to give the impression that we're striving for perfection. I would not be able to give the impression that we're striving for perfection, but Susan Howard, who has worked with me for 30 years to make this garden, is capable of striving for perfection. So we are a great team. I mean, nothing important happens without many discussions and with Sue and decisions made with Sue. She's with me every Friday, been with me every Friday for 25 years. So we garden together and then have dinner together Friday night. So there should also be internal views. There are these long views, but the garden should entice you to explore it and find places to pause and reflect between those great views and to draw the eye on. I really like it when people come to visit, and I like to see the choices they make as to where they want to go. That gives me great pleasure. And then it needs to be a country garden, relaxed and exuberant in feeling, and it should evolve and not stand still, and should be interesting in all seasons. And then this is something I think I learned from Frank, or was able to articulate thanks to Frank, was that the garden should make an emotional impact on me and visitors. And I mean, the main purpose of the garden is for my own health and well-being, and the pleasure of working in it, being outside and absorbed in the natural world. But I do love to share it. Right, so here's our run. I'm going to apologize for the speed of which we do this, but the flower garden, which was being made when I was working in Stephen Parrish's Northcote, and I mean, look at the variety of plants and what he called his flower garden. There are trees and cut-back shrubs and vines and roses and perennials and tender perennials, and bulbs and annuals and tropicals. And then also, I was looking at so many images of Ellen Shipman gardens and trying to understand her aesthetic, her plants, her way of putting plants together to create a garden that sings. And so the Maine flower garden really came through the lens of both those experiences. And I see some of that in there. It's a garden with conifers, and it used to have a couple of trees, cut-back shrubs, mostly perennials, fewer annuals, a number of bulbs. And now we're going to walk through the seasons of an early May view, cutting back the willows and the roses. Barberries are part of the garden. They're all red-leafed varieties. They're not seeding themselves over the past 25 years. I can have that conversation, but they're stable for now. And I think you'll see that they might lend a great deal of presence to and structure to the garden, along with the upright thuyas, de Groot's spire, and the garden is meant to really start to come into its own in late May with the emerging green and yellow foliage, and then the addition in the past few years of Camassia leclinii and allium purple sensation. And there's really this exuberant 2-week celebration in late May, early June. And then the old-fashioned stalwarts come along, the bearded iris and the Siberian iris, the geraniums, and then the peony, Sarah Bernhardt, and then the roses, late June, just a few rugoses, William Baffin, pink Grutendorst, albas, and then delphiniums continue to perform well for us, especially the German varieties. This is one called Volker Frieden, and these plants last 15 plus years in the garden. And then collecting phlox. One of my first collections were phloxes from the Cornish gardens. And we have phlox in bloom from the 1st of July into the second week and maybe later of October. And here's a garden, here's a plant I discovered on Mount Desert Island in the Houghton Garden. Really great garden plant, Campanula lactiflora, Pritchard's variety, that just goes on and on and on. Does really well for us. And then the Serrata hydrangeas, this one being Annie's Blue, and I've incorporated them into the Maine flower garden. And then sort of a very shipman-like combination of a tall Veronica longifolia and phlox and clematis pearl d'azur, and hollyhocks from the St. Gaudens site. There are many new phlox paniculatas that have entered the garden as well, and the panicle hydrangeas are becoming more and more a part of the flower garden. The flower garden is sort of at its floriferous height. We're coming up to that, and not just and floriferous height and pollinator frenzy height too. August is really an exuberant time in the flower garden. When I do my next talk about the challenges, it will be the challenges of keeping this kind of garden upright in a year like this. But every year is not a year like this. And then I love the senescent garden in October. I really hate cutting it back, but we cut it back gradually through the month of October. And then we've learned that there's some stems that we leave for the winter and do a final cutback in the spring. Now we're going to walk under this arch of a honeysuckle into a large grassy area, and a border that early on was my collection of Phlox paniculata. And it was the wrong thing to do. I say that a winter did them in, but you don't need to believe me. But anyway, they went away, and this garden was made at a time when, thinking about Dan Hinckley and thinking about a lot of the gardens that we learned about in Martha Stewart Living, with exuberant tropicals. Well, I wasn't going to do the exuberant tropicals, but what exuberant perennials and shrubs could make a tropical feeling exuberant border. So various willows, Stephanandra, Darmra, euphorbias, a backdrop of a number of different climbing hydrangeas, Magnolia tripetala as a cutback shrub, a rosemary leaf willow, a non-threatening buckthorn, Rhamnus frangula splenifolia, and this wonderful rayum, the Himalayan rhubarb that came from the Beijing Botanic Garden via the Arnold Arboretum, Redgersias in all sorts of variety, and euphorbia, sedges, and this part of the garden is standing up to what this year is dealing us. And then the barn creates its own environment and a place to grow climbing hydrangea, which is just a buzz with bees and pollinators for almost the entire month of June. It's worked its way in between the barn boards, and in this protected spot again, working with foliage. This next section really is all about foliage, and I do see that I need to step on it. So spring with trilliums and the beautiful red emerging foliage of Regencia podophylla, and then just 3 weeks later, that same scene. And this little section is a very small part of the garden, but I probably get more foliage and flower impact out of this section of the garden than many, many others. And so the foliage is hostas and European ginger and Regercias, and then the beautiful flower of podophylla, which then fades pink for the remainder of the season, peonies and Meconopsis. And here we are with this one small spot. This is probably 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, epimediums, hellebores, primulas, peonies, first arrival, Mauritii, viburnum, the clawed shride, Mardigan lily, and then now this is what it's looking like this next couple of weeks. The cardinal flowers have just opened up, the willow leaf gentians are about to come, and the anemones are just about on their way as well. So now we're going to walk up to the rock garden past the border of Himalayan rhubarb, and so this was the dairy parlor, and this is a shaded area under apples. And so we start with snowdrops, primulas, ferns, a whole collection of horticultural types of ferns, mostly male ferns and maidenhairs, fothergilla, tiarella, and greens, primulas, epimedium, and then the last plant to bloom in the shaded area is this Korean Actea, Cimicifuga. That is sort of the last thing that drowsy bees fall on. And the rock garden was inspired by the rock garden at the Fells with its central rill, but there is no rill. There is sort of broken gutters in what had been the milking parlor, and a collection of phlox subulatas in the month of May, and in June, Times, and this wonderful sedum Weihenstephaner gold. And then after that Maine spring show, there are just bits and pieces of stackies and willows, the gentian, the willow leaf gentian. And then as I was trying to make the rock garden at the Fells, and that garden had really wonderful drainage, this flat milking parlor had no drainage whatsoever. So the choice alpines that needed drainage, needed not special attention, but just needed sharp drainage, found a home in these wonderful troughs that are mostly from Stonecrop Gardens, where they're made in the winter, and I would treat myself to one or two every spring and bring them home and plant them with plants that were coming from places like Don Avery's Katie's Falls Nursery up in Morrisville, Vermont, and from West Coast suppliers of Primula marginatas, such as Edelweiss perennials. And if one rock garden wasn't enough, there was a better location, better drainage, out of the sun, and a place to grow Daphnes and Gentiana caulis, and again, a place that has such great presence in the late season with asters and the saxifrages and the androsaces tightening up and becoming more silvery. So we're going to step out of the rock garden now into the stable, and its protected walls allowed for ground covers, but also to patch in the crevices of the walls, various saxifrages and primulas. And another recent collecting venture is the Korean mountain maples, Acer pseudosiboldianum. And I promise you, we're winding down. We're walking through the out of the stable into what I call new meadow, inspired by the plantings that we all know from the High Line and other gardens of Pete Aldoff, and seeing what would work here. And echinaceas and various salvias did not work. The yarrows did not work. It's very heavy soil. But what did work are the alliums and various asters and verbascums, and especially the sanguisorbias and two grasses, the descampsia, the tufted hairgrass, and prairie dropseed. And in a good year, this is what that scene could look like in November and early December. The last garden that was made before the book is silver and gold, and inspired by a really great dogwood, Cornus silver and gold, Cornus ceracea silver and gold, that Dick Leidy introduced to cultivation. And it retains its variegation, it's disease-free, it has a great year-round presence, spring view of it, and then yellow stems throughout the winter. And the name of that plant gave me the idea for an area that would focus on the gold foliage of the freesia, the black locust frisia, and then various elderberries and willows and pearly everlastings and a variegated hydrangea serrata from Issaman Nursery in Rhode Island. And then I learned from the people at Great Dixter about working with bulbs in these very dense gardens and utilizing sort of the understory of the shrubs as a location for bulbs, mostly narcissus. But this area is becoming much more alive with spring interest. And this is our last shot of the newest area, still in being conceived and being made. And I really thank you for your attention on this journey through the garden.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. At this point, I'd like to open up the floor to any questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll come over with the mic.
So, Christine, you want people to ask with the microphone, or?
Yes, please.
Yep.
So, Bill, one of the principles you spoke to was this notion of the quality of light. And I'm wondering, as you moved to the second last and the last garden, how you were framing that, because you talked a lot about the plants,
right?
Not so much about what the quality of the light was that you were after. Some areas, like your birches, that's a dappled light, but has very bright spots.
Right.
So the question of, as you progress, what was your conception of light to have variation work for you?
So I didn't show a photo of what I'm calling this last part. 2 years ago, we removed a 40-foot long swath of shrubs that I had mistakenly planted for screening. And so I'm working with density to screen from the road. So up to this height needs to be really, in one part, needs to be really dense. I'm going to come back to your question, but I know that there's another question about deer. We do not fence for deer. So deer are part of the equation in this garden, okay? So dogwoods for density, and then there's already the freesia, the robinia there, and an oak that I planted 15 years ago that is coming along. And that portion of the garden has the harshest and hottest sunlight anywhere on the property. And I'm wanting to mitigate that strong light coming in on us and the plants. So the oak is going to take care of the worst of the western sun, the late afternoon western sun. And the more gardened part is being framed with, so some of the upper story is already there, and then middle story of Acer pseudosibuldianum. And then a shrubby story of fothergilla and hydrangea, and then the ground cover is going to be largely hellebore, which is reflecting light from in that area is reflecting light from the base, and a sedge, which I have yet to select, but I'm trying to tie this into another area, and that other area has a variegated fine leaf sedge, which gives this, sort of reflected quality. Does that answer? Good question, thank you. Got another one? Anyone else? Martha. The question is, Martha would like to know a little bit about what I do to help people establish the future of their gardens. I had a very long and very rewarding career working for the Garden Conservancy doing just that. And that came to an end about 10 years ago. And in the intervening 10 years, I've worked with some of the gardens that I had been working with there, Bell and some new gardens. So the Garden Conservancy could bring sort of a national focus and heft to a garden. Bill Noble can't bring a whole lot of heft, but I can bring some experience, and I'm now of an age where I'm seeing that some of my early optimism was maybe a little misplaced at times. So I think what I bring to working with people who are trying to preserve gardens is that I ask them some very tough questions at the very beginning. And I had that experience with the owner of a really significant garden last fall. And I put together 2 pages of questions, and we worked our way through them. And it was a great experience for both of us because we were both seeing things. He was seeing things that he needed to think about that he hadn't thought about before, which was the service that I could provide. And that's the best kind of service that I can provide is to ask tough questions, and then to be able to help guide where the answers to those questions go, and to refer people to some of the gardens that are succeeding. So the Lord and Scriver Garden in the Pacific Northwest is succeeding. The Ruth Bancroft Garden is succeeding. The Chase Garden didn't succeed as a public garden. It got sold, and there's a conservation easement on it. Hollister House is succeeding. There's no one formula, but if I have to say anything, it's about the garden itself needs to be able to survive.
the people who are responsible for it, the stewards, need to feel passionately about transferring it to the next generation and to the public. And there's got to be a bunch of money.
Can you talk about soil?
My own soil? And I'll say sometimes there's some locations where you can't have proper soil. Right? I mean, am I speaking to the choir? And the garden needs to reflect that. So the plants, the garden needs to reflect the basis of what's there. And so for me, the basis of what was there is a really good loam. Took me a while to figure out the pH. I didn't do the tests, right? Okay. And so it took a while to figure out what really thrived there and didn't because of the soil chemistry. So understanding your soil chemistry and composition and texture is really important. And so I had the luxury of being able to make a garden on what had been a farm for 150 years. So there was a lot of stuff around. But if I were making a garden on the coast of Maine, and I'm making a garden on the coast of Maine in Camden, and there actually is some soil there. And so we're making a garden that is full of some really wonderful horticultural shrubs, but also a garden that is full of blueberries, and junipers, but then what am I going to say there? I'm probably going on too long because I've never gardened right on ledge. But looking, this garden that I happened to walk through for 20 minutes today, that is a garden of moss and rhododendrons seeding themselves in and blueberries, and my client in Camden would kill for this garden. So there is that.
Well, how do you perpetuate the 20 acres that you're looking at in this photo right here? What are your plans for the future? To keep it from succeeding or having your introductions like Ms. Mackenzie's extend into that field?
Great question. So the 10 acres of woods is failing white pine, 50-year-old white pine, and buckthorn. Okay? I rarely go into those woods. The neighboring woods are buckthorn. The roadside in front of the house is full of Mrs. Mackenzie's honeysuckle and some roses and goutweed, and my contribution to and hydrangea arborescens, which may have been planted, maybe not. And my contribution to that has been red currants. So I'm no longer growing red currants. And I haven't made any other contributions to that yet that I'm aware of. The phlox paniculata is seeding itself into the field, just at the edge. My plan is, if I can, to stick with this garden for another 10 years. I don't know what happens after that. I'm not preserving it. And who's going to want someone else's garden of this extent, right? So I don't know. I mean, in a way, I can't think about it. But other than the questions of stewardship, and I mean, certainly before, if I'm lucky enough, I'll have a few years warning before I actually leave, so that I will remove barberries. Well, I mean, what I've just done this past 2 years is that I had a big stand of Cerbaria sorbifolia, Falciurospirea. So that's all gone. That's where this new garden with the light and so forth, that's where that's happening. And then for screening, I planted native dogwood and sumac. And those are in the process of being disassembled. So I'm, you know, so in my career, I was trying to help people think about the future. In my own garden, I can't think about the future. Any other questions or had enough, right? Yeah. Yes, all of the conifers in the garden are wrapped in the winter with, well, and some with either with netting, burlap, or caging, and the caging stays on some of them. It takes Sue and me a half day to protect the garden in November and a half day in the spring to remove everything and store it away in the barn. And then in the summer, it was never really a problem until this year has been the problem. But so far what's working is a preventive spray of a commercial spray along the margins and where I know they are moving through the garden. They're in the field and they move from the field to a neighboring field. And they move through the hydrangea serratas and the smooth hydrangeas. Yeah, I'd walk through. I've done it a half times. I mean, it.
Don't you think if you make a commitment to spray liquid fence regularly, and that it works?
I've been using Bob-X, and yeah, even with all the rain.
You have to spray after rain.
Yeah, and I have a really nice stand of Diananthe, which they've always gotten. I mean, the last 3-4 years they've always gotten. This year I've been on the Diananthe since I saw the first nibble, and it's been okay. Well, it is a commitment. And the other thing I found about the flower garden is that they'll only browse the margin of it. They don't come in. The woodchucks come into the flower garden. There's actually a den in the flower garden. But I find I can spray that edge just once or twice, and that's it. That deters them, because that's not their regular route. Have you had enough? Thank you. Thank you.